So today we celebrate the Feast of Epiphany, and we remember this story of the wise men, the Magi, who not only observed the stars in the sky, but also pay close attention to the sacred text of their time, including the Hebrew Scriptures. And their study of all of this leads them to come from the east to see this child for themselves, and when they find him, they are overwhelmed with awe. And they experience an epiphany. Now, the word epiphany literally means shining forth. So something is shining forth in this child. But as J. Philip Newell, the Celtic Christian, points out, it is not an appearance of God, as if God could not be there and then suddenly appears. No, it is what's called a transparence of God. They see what is always there, but we too often don't see. The light that shines forth from the child is the light that is at the heart of all of life, including yours and mine. And if we were somehow able to extract all that light out of the universe, everything would cease to exist, including all of us. Elizabeth Barrett Browning says it this way. She says, "Earth is crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. And those who learn to see take off their shoes." The Magi are taking off their shoes today, and they are seeing something important, and it changes their response. It changes the rest of their lives and the decisions that they will make. And so I want to study this story the way they studied the stars and the way they studied the text. And I want to look at what it has to teach us about how we can live with fear. Now, I've bitten off a lot, and I hope you can hang in there with me, but I think there's some important messages here for us. Glennon Doyle calls this story a brutal story. Brutal, beautiful, and brutal at the same time. And it is brutal. This king, this power-hungry king, so threatened by the birth of this child who will one day become king, so frightened at his presence that he devises this plan, this devious plan to send the Magi to him to reveal his whereabouts. And then when he is betrayed by those same Magi, he is so angry and scared, he kills all the children under the age of 2, hoping to get that one child. This is brutal stuff. This is the part of the story we don't tell at the pop-up Christmas pageant. This is the adult-only version, but I think it's an important one. It's an important part of the story. Because the reality is, life is brutal. We don't have to look very far to recognize how harsh and brutal it is. And we don't have to wait too long before Jesus is facing some harsh and brutal realities in his own life, including his inevitable eventual death at the hands of this unholy alliance between political and religious leaders. A reminder that the Christ child doesn't usher in a utopia and isn't born into a utopia, but comes into the real world that the prophet Isaiah says is a world of thick or deep darkness. A darkness that is in part created and sustained by our sin, by our evil, and the sin and evil of the systems that we create as human beings. A reminder that God, Emmanuel, is with us in the mess, in the darkness, in the harsh and brutal realities of life. The real world is a mess. We don't have to look very far. There are people killing each other in Ukraine, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan, just to name a few countries. And we see even in our country, people are being killed in shopping malls and college campuses, in elementary schools, and in the inner cities of our country. We don't have to look very far to see people dying from preventable illnesses and diseases. People dying because they don't have enough food, dying from extreme poverty and hunger, from polluted water. And we don't have to look very far to see religious and political leaders misusing power, neglecting the common good, trying to manipulate the masses towards their own personal agenda. And technology, something that has given us so much, we're able to worship from afar, can be misused and co-opted to surveil and to spread misinformation. It can even be weaponized on the battlefield. We live in a land of thick darkness. And it's frightening, if we're honest. And not only, I think, is King Herod frightened, so are the Magi. They are frightened. But they make a different choice. And that's what I want to explore today. I always like to remember that in the Bible, there are 365 occasions where some angel or messenger of the divine says, "Do not be afraid." And I don't think that's a shaming, "Do not be afraid, you silly person." No, I think it's an acknowledgement that life is frightening and we will experience fear every single day. Legitimate fear, healthy fear. For life can be incredibly scary. Neuroscience teaches us that as human beings, we have different parts of the brain, and the least evolved part, the amygdala, is the same brain that reptiles have. And when we're living out of that part of our brain, we're just reacting. It's impulsive, right? But we also have the capacity to live out of the prefrontal cortex, which is the place where judgment and wisdom can materialize, when we can make alternative choices to the impulsive one that the amygdala makes. The amygdala has 4 basic responses, and we've probably heard fight or flight. Those are 2 of the most famous, right? But there's also freeze and fawn. The amygdala wants us to survive at all costs. And so when it's scared, sometimes it becomes unable to speak or to move. We freeze. We literally are paralyzed, right, in fear. Have you ever experienced that? Or we realize somebody's about to hurt us, an abuser, and so what do we try to do? We try to appease the abuser so they won't bully us, so they won't hurt us. That's what the amygdala knows how to do. Now, there are occasions, of course, when this makes all the sense in the world. If you were being attacked by a lion, you would want to either fight that lion off of you or run like crazy and get out of the place, right? Or if somebody was trying to find you in your home, somebody, an intruder or a robber, you would go and hide yourself in the closet and try to be as quiet as possible, right? Or if you were being tortured by an abuser, you might fawn over that abuser to get out of that harmful situation. There are times when those responses are appropriate, but most of the time, they're not. They're the lesser evolved response, the reactive, impulsive response. So how do we move past that kind of tendency in the base of our brain, and how do we make a different decision? I think the Magi give us a clue, because they do 2 things. They see the thick darkness. They don't deny its presence. They don't run from it. They recognize the thick darkness, the world, the real world that they live in. But they also see deeply that the divine light is emanating and shining forth even in that thick darkness. And I think we get a glimpse as to what they see, even though we're not there and we don't know exactly what that experience was like, that epiphany. I think in the gifts that we bring, there are some clues. I think Matthew drops these clues for us. For gold was a precious commodity. It was the most valuable commodity, more valuable than gems and stones and servants and livestock. It was something that was hard to find, and when you had it, you were wealthy. It was a sign of nobility. And when Queen Sheba came to visit King Solomon, she came bearing gifts of gold. And somehow the Magi see that this is a king. They are bringing the most precious gift. And perhaps they're given a glimpse that this is the King of Kings, more powerful than any earthly king, including Herod. But it goes even deeper than that. You see, the way the temple was constructed, that the deeper you went into the temple, at the center was the Holy of Holies. And that place was a place only the priest could enter. And the priest would enter the Holy of Holies and offer sacrifice, incense to God, and would experience the presence of God. And that Holy of Holies was adorned with gold. Gold. Evidence that maybe the Magi saw something of God in this Christ child. Something of God shining forth in the Holy of Holies. Maybe they were given a glimpse at the depth dimension of reality. The second gift was frankincense, which is used all around the world. We used it at the contemporary service today as part of our anointing. And in the ancient Near East, the cost of frankincense was so great that it was only used on special occasions. Frankincense gives off this beautiful, strong aroma. It's like the best Lysol that you could ever spray. It's a beautiful smell. And so because it was so expensive, they could only use it on special occasions. And so they would use it in worship. And the priest would burn incense that was mixed with pure frankincense. And so by bringing frankincense to this child, they're recognizing something pure and clear in this child. Something clear about God, something clear about what this life is about. And finally, myrrh, a fragrant spice also used for incense, but also having healing properties, used as a tonic or an antiseptic or a healing balm. Used to ritually prepare the worship space. All the worship tools would be washed with myrrh. The temple, or the priest would bathe himself with myrrh. It would prepare the space for worship, and it would also prepare a body for burial. Seeing perhaps the healing and cleansing dimension of Christ. Not only in that moment, but in history. So today we remember these Magi. We remember how they set out on a journey, how they were overwhelmed with joy when the star they were following stopped over the place that the Christ child was. How they entered the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They knelt down and they paid him homage, and they opened their treasure chests and they offered these precious and meaningful gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But they did so much more than that. When they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they listened and they responded, and they risked their lives by refusing to obey the king's order and refusing to sell out the Christ child. And we are told they went home by another road. They chose an alternative. I think the wise men help us to see that there's something more powerful than fear. And when fear comes upon us, it overwhelms us. And our fears are stoked, and social media and things like that are weaponized right at our amygdala. And we are given so much encouragement to act impulsively and reactively. But the wise men offer another path. And that path is the way of sacrificial love. That love is the pure gold that we can only discover in the Holy of Holies, which Paul understands to be the inner sanctum of your heart. That's where you can discover the wisdom revealed in the Christ child. The love that is an aroma that goes with us, serving as an air freshener wherever we are, not because we're making it happen, but because we are being transformed into love. And by doing that, we change communities, we change people just by being who we are as little Christ. The love that has this healing property that is so needed in a world ruled by sin and evil and death. But the only way to see this is to face the thick darkness. The only way to see the divine light emanating through everything is to turn and face the darkness and to learn how to hold that fear that will come every time we are afraid. To recognize that we have more capacity in us than right here. We have this that we can live into, that we have this prefrontal cortex that we ought to be developing here when we gather in community and when we practice prayer and practice our faith. The part of us that can lead us into wisdom and judgment and love. You see, within you, within me, there is more than an inner King Herod. There's an inner magician. Maybe no one's ever told you that in you there's a magician. That if you give yourself to this sacrificial love, you're going to change things, not by trying, but just by being who you are. As Jesus transformed things by his presence, the way he saw people, the way he loved people, the way he touched people, the way that he stood up to the powerful with humility. The only way to see the divine light is to face the darkness and to bring forth your inner magician. Denise Levertov says it this way on the mystery of the incarnation. She writes, "It's when we face for a moment the worst our kind can do and shudder to know the taint in our own selves that awe cracks the mind's shell and enters the heart." Like the Magi who discover the divine light at the heart of the darkness, and like Jesus who discovers, even as he's sweating blood, that there is a love more powerful than the fear that he must have experienced in that moment, we can do the same. We can remember that as real as our fear is, as natural, as normal, even as healthy as it is no more real than the love that holds us when we are afraid. The love that is the depth dimension of everything. And so we can develop this part of ourselves. We can learn to not be afraid of being afraid. We can learn to see fear for what it is, to name it and to acknowledge it and to refuse to let it terrorize us and to be liberated from the tyranny of our fear. And why can we do this and how can we do this? Because we've seen the transparency of God in the Christ child. And once we see it, it changes everything. Amen.